This is a review of classic video games. Hello, I'm Joey, and I'm here to talk about a video game or two where science has gotten a handle on the supernatural. Grab your mystical artifacts or any advanced alien technology you may have salvaged. It's time for us to plot a course to another universe. We're breaking through the barriers of space and time to take a look at a universe that is portrayed in a video game or two. Yes, it's about time we check out the universe of Ghostbusters. Sega Ghostbusters. Ghostbusters for the Sega Master System and Sega Genesis. Also, the Sega Mega Drive. So, to peer into the Ghostbusters universe at the point in space and time we want to take a look, well, I'll just have to dust off the old Sega Master System. And in the case of my Sega Master System, I really have to dust it off. My room is quite dusty. Or I could always just stick the power-based converter onto the Sega Genesis. Yeah, backwards compatibility was always an important thing in the world of video games. This first Ghostbusters video game, which is based on the Commodore 64 game, or, well, the computer game, by Activision, has a bit of a bad name, even though the Commodore 64 version of the game, which is really the original version of the game, is widely respected. The Nintendo Entertainment System version of the game became so notorious. This game in all its forms have a bit of a bad rap thanks to that. However, the Commodore 64 version of this game was excellent, and so was the Sega Master System game. Atari 2600 also got an adaptation of this game, and is actually fun, if you know how to play the Atari 2600 game, because it does use a lot of the switches and controls on the Atari 2600 console, and if you don't have the manual, it could be confusing. It's not bad at all, actually. Pretty crude. Nowhere near the quality, or I should say nowhere near the advancements of the Commodore 64 or Sega game. However, it's not nearly as screwed up as the Nintendo Entertainment System version of the game. One of the really special features about Ghostbusters on the Sega Master System, which was also pretty cool about the original Commodore 64 version of the game, is the ability to use an account number. At the start of the game, all versions of the game, the bank loans you a certain amount of money. Basically, to complete the game, you have to finish with more money than you started. So you can pay off the bank, basically. And you can stay open as a Ghostbusters business. When the psychokinetic energy gets high enough that Gozer attacks, you have to be able to stay in business. And then you fight Gozer. And it's a pretty simple concept. The main part of the game is busting ghosts and earning money for it. But of course, if you have more money than you had from your original bank loan at the end of the game, you can start your next game with the amount of money you finished the previous game with. Even if you didn't successfully defeat Gozer, you can start over again with more money than the bank originally loaned you the first time you play. Commodore 64 and Sega Master System both allow you to do that. You can keep building up more and more and more money, which is a pretty cool feature. And it allows you to buy more expensive cars, allows you to buy all the ghost-busting equipment you could want, and just for the hell of it, I collected enough money to buy everything and complete the game without much effort. Because if each time you finish the game you have a little bit more money, that's no problem. And I looked at the numbers, and every now and then I'd figure, oh, if I change this number here and change that number there, maybe I'll get an account number that's a little bit higher. Because basically the account number they give you at the end of the game is like a password code. And over time, playing the game a little bit more and more, and every now and then jumping ahead so many numbers of dollars just by looking at what the account number is and figuring out a higher number, I went through this game and collected the maximum amount of money. And there's actually more than one code for the maximum amount of money. So, let's see. I even wrote down what day I did it on. It was August 17th, 1993. I got this game near the end of 1992. It was my first Sega Master System game. So it wasn't until 1993 that I collected all the money possible, and I played this game a lot. I absolutely loved this game. Apparently, there's more than one code to give you a specific amount of money, which is kind of interesting, I thought. And it is dependent on your initials. If you remember, in the Ghostbusters movie, it was Raymond Stan's choice what vehicle he acquired to be their Ecto-01, their Ghostbusting mobile, the Ectomobile. Upon buying it and talking to Peter Venkman about it, you can see Peter Venkman gets a look like, oh no, he actually spent money on this thing when Ray is talking about it. But Ray chose to get the old Cadillac, which is the model commonly used for ambulances and hearses. This one was previously used as a hearse. Well, in the Sega version of the Ghostbusters video game, just like in the Commodore 64 version of the game, you get to make that choice. You pick your Ecto-01. An efficient little economy car, which can only carry so much. A sports car, which is ridiculously expensive and incredibly fast and can't carry very much. A hearse, much like Ecto-01. Or what is referred to as a common car, but must be a fairly large wagon if it's able to carry more than the hearse. You also get to choose how you equip your Ectomobile, which can affect how often you have to unload your ghost traps, and quite a few other features in the game as well, too. I know how I'll equip my Cavalier to voyage into other universes such as the Ghostbusters universe. In the Ghostbusters video game, the Zool building, the building created by Ivo Shandor, plays an important role. Although Ivo Shandor isn't really mentioned in the game, the building is the focus point for all the ghost activity, and the reason why the ghost activity is stirred up in the first place. And although Ivo Shandor is not mentioned in the game, he is mentioned in the movie the game is based on, as well as the novels which are adapted from the movie, and also the later video game on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 that functions as a sequel to the Ghostbusters movies and the series in general. Ivo Shandor was in many ways a highly intelligent man in the Ghostbusters universe, whom come to the realization that the human species might be too sick to survive, and I can kind of understand that. Pretty brutal and cruel species, you know, the humans. And so he started worshipping Gozer, a being who doesn't seem much better. Amongst his cult of Gozer worshippers, they began to develop the science to bring Gozer to Earth, or perhaps back to Earth, as Gozer had become a powerful being that traveled away from Earth. If you look into the possible history of Gozer in Ghostbusters, the video game for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 and Windows computers. When the psychokinetic energy level gets to a certain point, crap breaks loose and the universe breaks open and Gozer comes to town. And apparently they don't go in that side door over there. But I guess if I get two of them in, they can break the door open to let the third guy get in.
Ivo Shandor and his cult of Gozer worshippers developed a building capable of drawing in psychokinetic energy or cosmic forces or whatever to concentrate that energy, building it up, stirring up ghost activity, making ghosts possible, creating an interdimensional rift, a doorway that would draw Gozer's attention and bring Gozer back to Earth.
And as the psychokinetic energy raises, eventually it'll get built up so much that Gozer will attack in the form of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. A Marshmallow Man will be created. The ghosts will all get together and form the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. And of course, from the movie, you'll realize that Gozer was picking a form for the Destructor out of the minds of the humans it encounters. And Raymond Stantz chooses Stay Puft because he doesn't think Stay Puft would ever harm anybody. And Stay Puft turns out to be a huge monster. And thus we have a Stay Puft Marshmallow Man attack. Well, in Ghostbusters the game, this takes place earlier in the game than it did in the movie. Once the psychokinetic energy levels reach a certain point, some versions of the game show it as a number value as it gets to a sufficiently high number. The Sega Master System version of the game, whenever the bar is red, you have the blue bar. Once that fills, you have the yellow bar. Once the yellow bar fills, you have the red bar. Anytime when you have the red bar, a Marshmallow Man attack can happen at any point. In this game, you can use what's called ghost bait to distract the ghosts away from the point where they were going to create the Marshmallow Man, and it'll hold them until the event is over. And you'll be awarded by the mayor for warding off the Marshmallow Man attack.
I've often thought of how driving in real life is a lot like a video game, with all the surprise road debris you'll encounter, large vehicles going over the painted lines, vehicles swerving towards you. In this game, it's in there too. Vehicles swerving back and forth across the road. Oddly enough, in the game, I've discovered that if you line your car up so it's going so one of the painted lines is lined up with the middle of your car, you can actually avoid a lot of the road obstructions, and usually you're lucky enough that the sideways swerving cars will completely miss you. Just completely miss you as long as you're in that position. It looks like this video game may have taken a little bit of inspiration from the real Ghostbusters animated series. Although in the movie, the Ghostbusters wear kind of grayish, tannish jumpsuits. In the animated series, Peter Venkman wore a sort of darker brown jumpsuit. And the Ghostbuster characters in this have a very Peter Venkman-like look to them.
Something that is both interesting in the Sega video games as well as perhaps might cause a little bit of cognitive dissonance as you meld it with the timeline of Ghostbusters presented in all other Ghostbusters media, as the Ghostbusters are known for developing their own equipment, and clearly developed their own equipment, is the shop where you buy your equipment. It's not too hard to imagine going to an electronics shop and buying the parts for the equipment that the Ghostbusters are building, and that's what you're actually buying when you go there. That's easy to reconcile with. However, when you get to the Sega Genesis Ghostbusters game, the shop owner refers to him as selling things for combating ghosts for hundreds of years, or at least that shop has, which seems a little bit odd. Makes you think that maybe that shop was developing the ghost-busting equipment, which doesn't really match up with the Ghostbusters that we know of. But that said, perhaps he just buys things that the Ghostbusters can make into their Ghostbusting equipment, which would indicate that other than the stuff that the Ghostbusters have on hand, he probably has a lot of crazy, superstitious stuff in his shop too. But the Ghostbusters generally don't go for the more superstitious stuff, at least not in most continuities based on the Ghostbusters. So it can be reconciled that how that shop owner could play a role in the Ghostbusters universe. And beyond that shop owner, the story in Ghostbusters for the Sega Genesis, minus the features that are merely exist in the way they're presented for gameplay, such as jumping and blasting like your Mega Man, except for that, it's really easy to take the story of the Ghostbusters game for the Sega Genesis and merge it as an early story in the Ghostbusters timeline, not that long after the first movie, as the Ghostbusters game on the Sega Genesis does appear to take place not very long after Ghostbusters for the Sega Master System. Music for Ghostbusters, the Mega cartridge, is excellent. Most of the music consists of one of the greatest themes of the 1980s, the Ghostbusters song itself, which actually plays out really well on the Sega Master System. It's basically all the music you need. But you also get a pretty cool ending theme. The ending music track is a good music track, but so is the Ghostbusters theme, and it's a very good version of it played in the Sega Master System version of this game. Ghostbusters on the Sega Genesis also has the main Ghostbusters theme. It's a bit underused. However, the game does have some pretty good music, but there are definitely a lot of really cool new music tracks added to Ghostbusters for the Sega Genesis.
Now it's time to jump ahead a little bit into the future. We'll move on to Ghostbusters for the Sega Genesis. Also, the Ghostbusters game for the Sega Mega Drive. Stick the game cartridge in the Sega Genesis, be it a Model 1 Sega Genesis or perhaps a Sega Genesis Nomad, much like we could put the previous Ghostbusters game in a Sega Master System or Genesis with the Power Base converter, or even a Game Gear with the Master Gear converter. There are a couple different ways to play.
Ghostbusters, the 16-bit cartridge.
Sega Genesis game. In fact, this Sega Genesis game was also available on the Sega Mega Drive, and these two games are kind of the same game.
Mega Drive could apply to a Sega Genesis sold just about anywhere in the world other than North America. The Mega Drive came out in 1988 in Japan. When it came to North America, it was renamed the Sega Genesis. But what would be different between this game and the Sega Mega Drive game, the Japanese version of the game? Well, the packaging, of course. These ones have these little tabs built in. This one did not have it ripped off. It wasn't designed with it. Other than that, the cases are very similar. The casing and artwork, of course, this one has more Japanese on it because it's designed for the Japanese market, sold in Japan. The cartridges are a different shape. This one is going to require an import device or a import converter like the Magic Key 3, which can play Sega Mega Drive games from anywhere in the world on a Sega Genesis. Some Sega Mega Drive games actually had lockout chips that would lock the game out of being played in other regions.
However, there is no region protection inside this game, just region recognition, which allows the game to either go into an English mode for the North American audience or a Japanese mode for the Japanese audience. So if you use the import converter to play Japanese games on your North American Sega Genesis system, it will trick the game into thinking it's being played on a Japanese Sega Mega Drive. However, that same game, if hooked onto a Game Genie and no code applied to the Game Genie, you will get the North American version of the game. The reverse is true. If you were to stick a Sega Genesis cartridge onto an import converter like the Magic Key 3, while the import converter is set to play Japanese games, it'll trick that North American game into thinking it's being played on the Japanese console, the Sega Mega Drive, and you'll get the Japanese version of the game. So all these game cartridges have the exact same game inside of them. The ones for the Mega Drive are a slight different shape than the North American Sega Genesis games, so you will need an import converter or something like a Game Genie just to fit them in the same system, as the Genesis version only really fits in the Sega Genesis, and the Mega Drive version would only really fit in the Mega Drive. I am only talking about the Ghostbusters game here. Not all Sega Genesis or Mega Drive games include both the Japanese and English version of the game on the cartridge. Some, like the Ghostbusters game, do include both versions of the game on the cartridge, but not all. Also, some games do include a lockout chip, in which case some of this will not work as well. The Ghostbusters game does not include the lockout chip. While I have the Game Genie out, I might as well put in a code. Here's a code so you can play through the game pretty much like normal, except just think of this as a little raise from the mayor. Sometimes the mayor funds the Ghostbusters activities. Well, you do get a little bit of money for every minor ghost, tiny small ghosts along the way that you defeat simply by blasting them with a proton pack. You normally get a tiny bit of money for each one of those, which is not included on the bill the person who hired you to do the task provides. But this Game Genie code will give you a lot more money for the small ghosts you disperse. Just think of it as a raise from the mayor. The Sega Genesis Ghostbusters game, or Ghostbusters, the 16-bit video game cartridge, features a character named Arthur. And Arthur is a parapsychologist like the Ghostbusters who is also researching ghosts. However, he apparently was changed and went evil after finding a mysterious tablet. This mysterious tablet that Arthur finds is the same tablet the Ghostbusters are finding fragments of. And after Arthur had found it, he had turned evil. The tablet must have changed him. The tablet appears to be, well, an object that can generate an interdimensional portal, allowing some nasty beings, not incredibly unlike Gozer, to come to Earth. A portal in a tablet, an interdimensional portal capable of unleashing ghost activity on the Earth. That's some pretty advanced claytronics going on in that tablet, I would assume.
The Stay Puft Marshmallow Man in Ghostbusters for the Sega Genesis, well, you get to discover his origin, and not the origin that you see in the Ghostbusters movie, which the previous Ghostbusters game was based on. And if you follow the real Ghostbusters, over time, after being disconnected from Gozer, the manifestation of Stay Puft that exists in the series The Real Ghostbusters, the animated series that kind of follows where the movie left off, Stay Puft eventually becomes a far more mellow being, perhaps the being that Ray Stantz originally envisioned him to be. Now, Stay Puft also is disconnected from Gozer in the Ghostbusters Sega Genesis game. And he has his own very special origin. You'll see in Stay Puft's mind how he believes he came into being. Which is kind of an interesting change. It's also worth noting that in the game, at no point do you actually trap the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. All the other boss ghosts from the earlier levels of the game get trapped after you defeat them. They will come back as sub-bosses, but not Stay Puft. Stay Puft does not come back as a sub-boss for a later level. Once he's defeated, he disappears and does not return to get trapped. So you don't actually trap Stay Puft in the Sega Genesis Ghostbusters game. although he is trapped in the real Ghostbusters animated series, he does make an appearance at the end of one of the episodes, indicating that in that episode he has not yet been trapped. He is shown being trapped in the opening theme. Whether or not the opening theme can be considered a canonical event or not is very questionable. And he is, throughout most of the series, viewed as a ghost that is trapped within the containment unit, which occasionally is lit out. I did make a point of saying it was time to take a look at the Ghostbusters games for the Sega systems. Well, we actually know what date the game takes place in. I would assume 1985 to make it not that long after the fall of 1984 when the Ghostbusters movie took place, thus also when the Ghostbusters first video game would have taken place, the adaptation of that movie. So Ghostbusters for the Sega Genesis, I assume, takes place in 1985. And if you look at the newspaper article about when the Ghostbusters bust their first ghosts on that case, it's February 4th. So this would be an excellent upload for February 4th.
I was planning to upload this video that I'm editing discussing the Ghostbusters video games on February 4th. Sort of a Sega Ghostbusters day. Well, due to the process of editing and just being distracted and slowed from my task, I missed the deadline of February 4th. And so I took a little break and then came back to it, and needless to say, I did not upload this on February the 4th. So this is an overdue discussion on Ghostbusters on the Sega video game consoles. Hopefully everybody had a happy Sega Ghostbusters Day, February 4th, as this is a very belated Sega Ghostbusters Day video.
And of course, it's very likely that they did their ghost busting on February 3rd if it made the February 4th newspaper, but it could be an evening edition. They could have did it earlier in the day and made the evening edition of the paper, the Sega newspaper.
I intended this to be a short video on a subject that I could return to later and discuss more in future videos. And while I do intend to return to the subject someday, I definitely went on longer than I planned to. But with Ghostbusters, one of the video games that really got me into playing video games, how could I not? When I came up with the title, UniMultiVerse Overview, it was my intention to do reviews where whatever was being portrayed in a series or part of a series, be it a comic book or video game or DVD, whatever it was, I'd not only review it and the concepts featured within it, but also compare it to other series. For example, a lot in Star Trek can complement Star Wars, and vice versa, and the same goes for Babylon 5 or Stargate, or for that matter, Ghostbusters. And most science fiction and fantasy concepts, they acknowledge parallel universes, so hey, even if there was never a crossover, there still is plenty of room for cross-comparing. My intention with UniMultiVerse Overview is to include cross-series sidetracks. Well, with UniMultiVerse Bits, or UniMultiVerse Overview Bits, the purpose is to do a shorter video and with a little less focus on related series, or similar series. Well, since this video already went on longer than I had planned, why not end with a cross-series comparison, some cross-series sidetracks.
I'll call out a reference to seemingly two unrelated things. as a way of introducing some cross-series sidetracks. And then one day I held aloft my plastic power sword and said, "By the power of Grayskull!" And a Chaos Emerald fell from the sky.
The original Phantasy Star is for the Sega Master System, while Phantasy Star 2, 3, and 4 are on the Sega Genesis. So spread across the same video game systems as the Sega Ghostbusters games, these Phantasy Star games have an excellent use of the supernatural, but keep everything in a science fiction setting. Ultimately, Phantasy Star IV is the story that tells us the origin of the Algo solar system, as well as explaining the source of the supernatural activity in the previous games. Speaking of great games with cosmic forces, the game Xenogears has a lot of supernatural themes in it, but Xenogears manages to use science fiction to make them fairly realistic. There's also Star Control. The original Star Control was on the Sega Genesis, and Star Control 2 was on the 3DO. While really Star Control 2 is the one that featured the most supernatural activity, mostly in the form of telepathy, although it's more science fiction telepathy than what most people would consider supernatural. It nonetheless does feature what is sometimes considered a supernatural theme in a science fiction environment, and you could look for other supernatural themes in the Star Control games as well. Hopefully you've enjoyed this review of the Sega Ghostbuster games. UniMultiVerse Bits, Sega Ghostbusters, BIT-01. These are great games, and perhaps they may never end up re-released on new systems. However, there are lots of old video game consoles still around, and sometimes new versions of the old consoles are released as well. And sometimes they even get the sound right on them, other times they don't. But whatever sort of console you're playing your video games on, I really think it's an excellent idea to keep these Ghostbusters games in mind. My first video game system was a ColecoVision with the expansion module number 1. The expansion module allows you to play Atari 2600 games, and while most of my friends that I had hung around with had Atari systems, at that time Sega and Nintendo were becoming quite a bit more popular, especially Nintendo. And the whole reason why I got my Nintendo Entertainment System was I was saving up for a Commodore 64 so I could play the Ghostbusters game. But of course, computers were a bit more expensive than the home consoles, so it was far more obtainable for me to either get a Sega Master System or a Nintendo Entertainment System. The Sega Master System got my attention faster, or at least it looked more interesting to me. But then I heard most people had Nintendo Entertainment Systems. In late 1989 or fall of 1989, I got my Nintendo Entertainment System because it was one way, other than the Commodore 64, I could play Ghostbusters and Spy vs. Spy, even if that was not the best version of the Ghostbusters game. When it was time to focus on a new system, I thought to myself, well, maybe I'll try that Sega Genesis. Sonic the Hedgehog looks interesting, and so does the Ghostbusters game. And maybe I'll also check out the Power Base Converter. And thus, for Christmas of 1992, I had begun collecting Sega merchandise, and got, for Christmas, at my request, a Sega Genesis, and was never disappointed. These Ghostbusters games got me involved in video gaming more than anything else probably could have. And the Sega Genesis, followed by the original PlayStation and the original Xbox, kept me active with video games for quite some time. This has been UniMultiVerse Bits, Sega Ghostbusters, BIT-01, video by Joey Fancy. This is how I would equip my Cavalier. This could be a hint as to what videos you can expect from UniMultiVerse Overview.